Hi everyone, this is just a short little supplemental video that I've been really wanting to make for like a week or more. So sorry it's coming out a little late. But I wanted to talk more about Spinoza's practical philosophy because there's a lot of interest in that. I think that sort of him being like an unorthodox religious figure in his excommunication from his temple and so on, I think that this has sort of produced like a lot of interest in what Spinoza thinks is like the right way to live your life. And just so that you'll know, when people use the distinction between practical and theoretical philosophy, in general, what they mean is that theoretical philosophy is like kind of most of the stuff that we've been interested in, which is like, what is the ultimate nature of reality? What is, how do we come to know that? What is the relationship between mind and body? Stuff like that. Whereas practical philosophy sort of deals with elements related to human action. So, like, maybe moral theories about what the right thing to do is, or maybe moral psychology. So, like, the psychology of people whenever they're deciding between right and wrong. Things like that. That's ultimately what is relevant for practical philosophy. It says a more direct connection to action, right? And this is going to be a little bit loose because I didn't like go and reread a bunch of Spinoza before preparing for this, so I apologize for that, but that's just how things are going to go. Spinoza's practical philosophy is really interesting. It's really interesting because in addition to sort of differing from Orthodox religious traditions in his conception of God, he also differs from them a lot in his conception of like what it means to live a good life. Um, yeah, and so like one thing that you might start out with as sort of a concern if you're like another 17th century person and you're talking with Spinoza is you might say like, well, in Orthodox religion there's a God, right? And that God is a person and is a judge of my actions, and so um, they can reward me if I live a good life, or they can punish me if I live a bad life. And I have a soul that persists through my death, and that, God, as sort of lawgiver, will decide what happens to my soul. What happens to my soul? Do I go to heaven? Do I go to hell? So on, right? And so, if you have that perspective and you look at Spinoza, then one thing that you might think is like, wow, so Spinoza denies that God has any personality, right? Like, God isn't a person making decisions, God is not a moral judge, and morality refers to concepts that only apply to finite creatures. So, there's a big contrast, I think, with Leibniz. Like, Leibniz thinks God ordered the world to be the best way, and to be the best way, especially for the creatures within the world, right? So, from that perspective, this offers some kind of solace, right? It's like, okay, well, even if bad things happen to me, like God knows that this is how to be the way the world is, and presumably there will be some sort of like return on investment in afterlife, right? And so you can kind of feel good about it even whenever you suffer misfortune, right? Whereas it seems like Spinoza's system sort of like leaves you out in the cold, right? It's like God doesn't care about you. All finite things proceed from God with the same necessity. So all the things that hurt you proceed from God with the exact same necessity as the things that help you, right? Um, and it almost seems like in that way that Spinoza's God, even though it is a God, is just as indifferent to you as like if you were an atheist, right? If you just had a universe that was governed by mechanical laws, right? And the entire universe and God is indifferent to whether or not you live or die, or you live a good life, or anything like that. And so I think that this is sort of the impetus behind a lot of responses to Spinoza that's like, hey, you're an atheist, which is that in consequence, like, you know, there's no moral lawgiver in God. It doesn't seem like there's really a soul in Spinoza. And so a lot of people have the worry that like you would have no reason really within Spinoza's system for acting morally, right? Like there's apparently like no reason why like you wouldn't like go and like rob and pillage and do whatever to like a whole bunch of other people. Like God doesn't say that that's morally wrong and it could be beneficial to you, so like doesn't that just make it morally right, you know? And so this is sort of the basis for a lot of responses to Spinoza. Is that, as one student put it, I forget who said this, but the anti-realism is a direct consequence of Spinoza's conception of God. Anti-realism about morality. So morality doesn't refer to like a real moral order that God set up. It just refers to categories that finite creatures have to use because they're finite, right? So, from this perspective, you want to ask, like, okay, well, then, if this is the assessment that, like, another 17th century person would have about Spinoza, like, how did Spinoza understand himself? How did Spinoza understand his own practical philosophy? Did he think that there was a reason for why you should act virtuously, and so on? And it turns out that the answer is yes. And Spinoza's arguments for this are really interesting, right? Basically, it comes from Spinoza's conception of freedom. Spinoza says that you're free when your existence, so how you actually live, reflects your essence, or it reflects your nature, right? So, like, for me, for Penelope, like, I think of, like, you might say that one thing that's in my nature is that I really want to teach philosophy, right? And so insofar as I can like kind of structure my life such that I can do that on a relatively consistent basis, then you could say that like I have some degree of freedom, right? But importantly, it's only in degrees, right? God is the only being whose existence fully follows from his essence, right? And they actually like can't ever come apart because God is not finite. There's no circumstance in which God could ever be restrained by anything else, right? So that's important. That means that finite creatures can sort of participate to some degree in the freedom that God has, but that it's always limited and constrained and conditioned in a way that God's freedom is not conditioned. So Spinoza then sort of develops not only like this concept of freedom, but he also develops a moral psychology, which means that he sort of has a theory about passions and emotions and which ones of those are sort of produced from your own activity, from freedom, and which ones are produced by passivity or the way that you're affected by other things. And so, a chief example of a passive emotion for Spinoza would be like fear, right? When you live in fear, you're afraid of the circumstances surrounding you impeding upon your life in various ways. And so in that way, you sort of like modify your own behavior according to the environment around you, and that in Spinoza's terms makes you less free. You're less reflective of your own life, how you'd like to live, and you're more determined by external circumstances. Whereas happiness, joy, emotions like that, those come from your own satisfaction in your freedom, and in that way that you're like God, right? Spinoza says at one point in part one that God is infinitely positive, right? And what he means by that is that like when we're sad, when we're fearful and so on, when we experience negative affect or emotion, that what's going on is that we are sort of like suffering the consequences of our external environment determining us in various ways. And so what that means is that those emotions are the product of unfreedom, right? They're the product of ways in which we're determined by our environment. And so for Spinoza, then, the sort of person that would like go and like pillage other people, would hurt them in order to get their own way, right? For them, you would say maybe like the essence of their personality, what they're trying to achieve, right, is material riches or whatever, or sensual pleasure or something like that. But for Spinoza, these things are always circumstantial, right? Happiness that comes from external things, that can always be taken away by someone else. Some bigger robber baron comes and takes your stuff and pillages you, and now you're sad, right? And so if your life is structured according to these external desires, then you're always in a situation where another finite being can come and take that away from you, both another human being, but also like a natural disaster or something like that, right? And so those desires are always precarious, and even when you achieve them, they're not really satisfying because they're fleeting, right? It's like you get the money, you spend the money, you feel good, and then it's over, right? And then you have to go get more, right? And so you're even more dependent on your external circumstances. But for Spinoza, Spinoza genuinely believes that if you do philosophy, then you know that all of these external circumstances are fleeting, all that kind of stuff, and that really the source of your happiness is your understanding of the rational nature of the universe, because everything ultimately proceeds from the essence of God. There's no reason to be scared or afraid or sad, right? Like, it's not like there's any additional guilt that happens, like, oh no, if I would have acted differently, then things could have been better for me, I could have lived the life that I want to live. All that stuff kind of washes away. At least that's what Spinoza believes. If you believe in his conception of God, is that all that stuff is ultimately really unimportant. It's not something that you could ever control. And so you should kind of do your best to not desire those sort of external things, or at least not to, beyond your means. Spinoza is not really like kind of as pious as other philosophers are. Like, he says things like, if you like, I think some philosophers, like, if you happen to run into happy external circumstances, they would tell you, like, don't enjoy it too much because it's fleeting. But Spinoza's attitude is the opposite, which is that, like, you have to actually take small joys whenever you get them, right? So, like, if you get whatever sandwich or whatever makes you happy, Spinoza is just like, yeah, you should genuinely enjoy that, because you don't know when it's going to end, and that your ability to like do the thing that you want to do is very fleeting, much more than you realize. And so you really have to take the opportunity to enjoy it. And that moment where you get to live the life that you want to live, that is basically God, right? Like that is a moment where your essence and your existence meet up, right, in the right way. And so there's no sense in abnegating from those moments. But at the same time, it's about developing positive attachments. Another thing that Spinoza says that I think is really interesting is he says, like, that a rational person thinks least of death than of all things. And for those of you who have taken like ancient Greek philosophy, you might notice that this is like the exact opposite of what Plato and Socrates say in the Phaedo, as well as other dialogues. For Spinoza, there's no point in thinking about death. Death is something that always comes externally, like, yeah, there can be an earthquake or a hurricane or you can get murdered or just die of old age, right? But all those things are ultimately fleeting. They come externally. There's nothing that you can do to prevent it. And so if you focus on that as sort of like what you're interested in or thinking about all the time, then you're constantly thinking about ways in which you're constrained by the world. You're not thinking about the ways in which sort of you can carve out your own little space, your own location where you can develop some sort of happiness, and in that way be closer to God, approximate the infinite sort of happiness that happens when your existence can completely correspond to your essence. So that's just to say a little bit about Spinoza's practical philosophy. It's really not exhaustive at all, but basically books 3 through 5, and there's 5 books in the Ethics we read, or parts of the Ethics we read. Part 1 and a little bit of part 2, but really 3 through 5 are all about how to live a good life, given the metaphysical system that Spinoza sets up at the outset. So I think it's really interesting. It's very different from a lot of philosophers. It really emphasizes the importance of happiness and joy. And I think that is something that's really special and unique about Spinoza, especially for this period, right? Like, there's no hell, there's no moral judgment, there's there's none of that. He's trying to dispel all of that to just allow people to try to organize their life and become free in a way that seemed very difficult in the 17th century. So yeah, that's just a really short supplemental thing about Spinoza's practical philosophy for people that are interested. I hope that you enjoyed this video.